Welcome to ODEON Capital Conversations on all things money and markets with Dick Bove and MAT VAN ALSTYNE. And here is your host, John AIDAN BYRNE.
On this episode, Dick Bove has the latest for us on US banks with earnings season in full swing. Despite some better than expected earnings, Dick says banks are facing multiple challenges, from pressure to increase their equity to proposed new bank rules. Dick says loan losses are skyrocketing. Consumer sales exceeded expectations in September. We'll look at that. The war between Israel and Hamas has shifted global dynamics, says the Wall Street Journal. JP Morgan's CEO Jamie Dimon says these may be the most dangerous times the world has seen in decades. Dick Bove and MAT VAN ALSTYNE will share their thoughts as investors weigh up our changed environment. What's up with David Solomon, CEO of Goldman Sachs, who keeps getting hammered by critics? Stay tuned for that, as well as more on the Green New Deal and the shift and search for clean energy, which may still not be so clean. I'm with Dick Bove, Chief Financial Strategist at ODEON Capital Group, and MAT VAN ALSTYNE, ODEON Co-founder and Managing Partner. And we'll be right back after this message.
Current and future holdings are subject to risk, and past performance is no guarantee of future results. This podcast should not be copied, distributed, published, or reproduced in whole or in part. Information presented herein is for discussion and illustrative purposes only and is not a recommendation or an offer or solicitation to buy or sell any securities. Securities identified do not represent all of the securities purchased, sold, or recommended to clients. The views and opinions expressed by the ODEON Capital Group speaker are their own as of the date of the recording. Any such views are subject to change at any time based upon market or other conditions, and ODEON Capital Group disclaims any responsibility to update such views. These views should not be relied on as investment advice, and because investment decisions are based on numerous factors, may not be relied on as an indication of trading intent on behalf of any ODEON Capital Group product. Neither ODEON Capital Group nor the speakers can be held responsible for any direct or incidental loss incurred by applying any of the information offered.
Dick and Matt, welcome for episode 91. We've lots to talk about. There's earnings season, the banks, of course, and we have conflict in the Middle East, in Israel versus Hamas. You were on with Maria Bartiromo this morning, Dick. You had an interesting reiteration of what you've been saying on this podcast, but you dug into it a little bit more, and you were talking about the banks being in trouble, serious trouble, and that the government will put the pressure on for them to significantly increase their equity. You broke down an example of Bank of America, really worth mentioning here. They were just one of the banks that has problems with their equity. And then the banks overall, you didn't seem overly optimistic, trouble ahead?
Yeah, well, I believe that, and I apologize, I'm going to repeat things that we said before, but I believe that in March, which is now referred to in the industry as March Madness because 3 banks went under and not basketball. But anyway, the point is that basically what the government understood at that point in time was that it had made a series of guarantees concerning the banking industry that it simply could not live up to. In other words, the president said that all of the deposits in all the banks in the United States were safe. The Secretary of the Treasury said, not as broad sweeping as what the president said, but that the banks, deposits are protected by the U.S. government. When you take a look at the mathematics, that doesn't work. There's $19 trillion in deposits in the banking industry, 11 trillion of which are backed by some type of government insurance. And the government only has about $160 billion in the kitty to back this. So right away, one understands if you're a bank regulator, we don't have the money to back all these deposits. We can't go to the Federal Reserve and ask them to print a couple of $1 trillion, if we run into trouble. And this is not back in the day of the S&Ls when, Senator Garn and Representative St. Germain passed a bill, basically opening the spigot for whatever the S&Ls were going to lose. The government was going to back it, and that wound up to be, I think, something on the order of $500 billion. But that was 40 or 50 years ago. Anyway, so the point is, what do you do if you're a regulator and you're being told that you've got to protect all the assets of the banking system, and you can't do it? Well, what you do is you try and reduce the assets of the banking system, and you try to reduce those assets which you're on the line to protect. And therefore, a couple of months ago, this report came out, which was 1,087 pages that we referred to. And in that report, there was a mechanism put in place which would allow the government to back away from a lot of these guarantees. For example, the government, put what they call risk weightings on the various assets that the banks held. And they increased the risk weightings so high for certain of these assets that the banks simply would find it uneconomic to pursue those businesses. In other words, if you're trading, there's a very high risk weighting on trading assets. If you are backing cash-only loans, in other words, credit cards are not backed by any specific asset the way a mortgage is, there's a very high, if you will, capital requirement there. If you're making loans which have very high loan to value ratios, obviously there's a hard asset there, but has a very high loan to value ratio, then, there's a high capital requirement there. So the banks are now screaming like murder. I mean, it doesn't matter which bank executive speaks in these conference calls. They're screaming about the fact that this can't be done, that it's my favorite hero, Jamie Dimon, said these rules are asinine. And basically, the recognition is there that what the government is doing is backing away from making promises that they cannot keep to this industry. So, when these bank earnings come out one by one, these banks are mentioning how they're going to have to increase their common equity. They're going to have to reduce the number of products that they sell. There are certain products in certain areas, which they're not going to get involved with any longer. There is going to be a big impact on the industry. It is going to be very negative, and it's troublesome. And again, I apologize, but in Bank of America, if you take a look at their balance sheet today, right, this bank is the second largest bank in the United States, around $3 trillion in assets. $1 trillion of those assets are either securities backed by the government, or mortgages, or auto loans. The yield that I'm guesstimating at, I'll be able to have a better figure in a couple of days, but the yield on that $1 trillion in assets is something on the order of just under 3%. It's actually, for the Treasury part of it, it's 2.5%. So now you have to ask yourself, what does Bank of America do? First off, if it were to value that $1 trillion in assets fairly, it's probably worth about $130 to $150 billion less than they claim it's worth. If you took and subtracted $130 to $150 billion off of the common equity of Bank of America, you would reduce it by 60%. In other words, only 40% of the common equity which they claim to have, do they really have?
Sorry, I have two questions, Dick. One, their reported unrealized losses is $131 billion. Are you saying if they were more accurate, it would be closer to $280 billion, or you're just using that broad number as a replacement for the $130 billion they're recognizing?
No, yeah, they're recognizing $130 billion, but that's only for the securities portfolio. They're not talking about, they've got $269 billion in home mortgages. The yield on those home mortgages is 3.01%. They're not worth $229 billion. They've got $100 billion. They don't break this number out the way I would like, but they got $100 billion, which are mostly mortgage auto loans. Those auto loans are yielding somewhere around 4.5%. Again, they don't break it out the way they do the home mortgages and the securities. So the average mortgage loan today is 8.25. So those loans are not worth $100 billion. So if you add it all together, roughly speaking, you got $1 trillion in loans, which may be worth in the marketplace somewhere on the order of $140 to $150 billion comes out of common equity.
I hear you, and I think Bank of America just like all the other banks are canaries in the coal mine, that this is a real problem. And as we've discussed, lower interest rates would help a lot of people and help a lot of people in the economy right now. But I want to just kind of reframe what you started off with, what March Madness of the banking sector. The way I hear it as a layman, as someone who doesn't really know the banking industry like you is, I hear it as there's an insurance company, it's the US government, they're insuring all these banks. And if we were to use home insurance as like something that's more understandable to someone like me, they had massive claims in March, and they wanted to announce to the world that, hey, we're stable. We still have enough money. We can support all the houses out there. We can support all the banks out there. And your point is, if all the banks fail, no, they don't have anywhere close to the amount of money. But that's not what insurance does. It doesn't plan for everyone failing all at once. It plans for the exceptions, and it has enough money because it collects a small amount from everybody that they can go in and rescue the exceptional event. So it's kind of like three homes in a neighborhood burn in a fire, and the insurance companies come out and say, look, we can afford these 3 homes, and we can afford, the next few home fires because we have enough money for that. But if the entire neighborhood or the entire city goes up, well, yeah, we're out of business. But it's not. And then what they do to prevent the whole neighborhood or whole city from burning up is they go in and check the roofs and check the trees and check the dryness and the water resources and the security of the collateral they're insuring to make sure that it's safer. And so from my perspective, it seems completely reasonable that the FDIC, who clearly doesn't have enough money to rescue the entire banking system all at once, goes in and tries to make the banking system safer. And yes, it makes it less profitable. And yes, it makes it harder to do business. But what they're trying to do is, one, shore up confidence amongst the consumers by telling them that, hey, we've got you. I don't like a lot of things that our presidents and our leaders say, but I do appreciate that Joe Biden came out and said the banking system is sound. And by the way, what else are they supposed to say? Even if it wasn't true, they're supposed to say that, because you can stoke the flames and create the problem that you're trying to avoid by not having that type of confidence. And 2, by taking steps to shore up the banking system, it seems to me that that's a prudent behavior if they're trying to prevent, 1, a bank run, and 2, a banking collapse. So I don't feel like it's as dire as you make it sound like, because the FDIC is not likely to be in a position where they have to rescue the entire banking system all at once.
Yeah, well, I think your example is a good one. They go in and they tell you to fix, your plumbing I got a problem. You don't have enough insulation. You have to, put better, studs behind, portions of your roof, right? But that costs money. What is happening to the banks is exactly that. They're saying, we want to make sure that you're not going to cost us any money because we're going to make sure that your balance sheet is in pristine condition. So we don't want you to make home mortgages, which are, over 80% loan to value. We don't want you to have a large position in trading. We don't want you to put your credit card position up to a point where, you got nothing behind those credit cards except, the expectation that the economy does well. And therefore, we're going to make sure that we don't let you do it. We're not going to let you do it. And the reason why we're not going to let you do it is we're going to put these different risk weightings, capital weightings on your risk-weighted assets. And that's what they're doing. And the bankers are saying, okay, you're making us safer. Well, I get it. But you're also reducing our income. You're reducing our ability to compete in the marketplace. You're reducing our ability to operate outside the United States, to compete against, foreign banks, none of whom have any of these requirements. In other words, there's a thing in the regulatory industry called the gold standard of regulations, and that is the regulators set up the regulations, and a various number of countries or banks decide to do even more than what the regulators are asking. And the United States has always been a gold standard country. It's always said, okay, if these are the regulations, fine, but we're going to do 10% bigger and better than the regulations. And therefore, the problem that the banking industry has is they're not going to be able to make as many loans. They're not going to be able to grow at the rate that they have done historically. And that ultimately is going to impact their ability to increase their earnings and increase their stock values, which is why bank stocks are doing so poorly in the market now.
You brought up Jamie Dimon. He said in an interview in recent days, this may be the most dangerous time the world has seen in decades. And he was referring, I suppose, to the trillions in debt in the US. Globally, we have unfunded liabilities here, as we've spoken about often, in the multiple trillions in the national debt of 33 trillion, consumer debt. A writer from Yahoo Finance said we should pay attention to anything Jamie Dimon says. He's a very powerful CEO, one of the biggest networks in the industry, and some really good information he receives on a regular and daily basis, and tremendous insights. Before you address that, Dick, because you've been providing a lot of data, you said Bank of America, if I understand it, it has, is it 100 billion in equity and not 250, if by your calculations?
Yeah, in other words, it's if you pick up the balance sheet is going to say this company has $256 billion in equity. If you mark to market that balance sheet, and I can't do it exactly because I don't have all the figures, my estimate is that they've got 100 billion against 3 trillion in assets, and that's unacceptable. And of course, what Bank of America says, and the regulators say, well, this is Bank of America, it's never going to get in trouble, et cetera, et cetera. But, 15 years ago, they didn't think that. 15 years ago, they thought Bank of America was going to go under. So, I don't think you can allow Bank of America to do that. But let's assume you're going to let them do it, right? Which is probably what is going to happen. The bottom line is, they got $1 trillion in assets, which are yielding well below market rates, which are yielding, in the case of the whole securities portfolio, less than 50% of the market rates. And that's a $770 billion portfolio. So it can't produce earnings equal to what other banks can produce that don't have assets tied up at 2.5%. And they can't pay as much for deposits as other people can pay, because the deposits, the yield that you get on the deposits is tied to the yield that they get on the investments they've made. So they're locked. They're locked for a few years. And everybody's running around today saying, gee, they had great earnings and the stock price, is up, a small amount, at the moment.
We should watch that. But then to Jamie Dimon, what was your take on it? I mean, he said this before, we have a big crisis on our hands. Everything is gloom and doom, but we seem to be in a darker place now than ever before by his telling.
Yeah, he's not talking about the industry. He's talking about the political economy. He's talking about the situation in the Ukraine. He's talking about the situation in Israel. He's talking about the situation in the House of Representatives. I mean, those are the things that he's talking about. I mean, Maria Bartiromo this morning, basically said, the president is going to Israel, which she thinks is a mistake because he's putting himself at physical risk. If something happens to him and the vice president, is not able to function, then there's nobody who is Speaker of the House of Representatives. So I believe the Secretary of State then becomes the president.
No, it's the Senate pro tem after that, then Secretary of State.
Dimon was talking about global geopolitical
right.
risks have heightened. Obviously, we have this terrible situation in Israel, Gaza Strip, Hamas, and now, of course, we have the Russia, Iran, China axis, as it were. I mean, there, I guess, a certain amount of glee these days in Vladimir Putin's household.
Today, Vladimir Putin is in Beijing. He was invited to go there by Xi Jinping because Xi Jinping is having this major conference of all of the countries that China has loaned money to. So he's asked Putin to speak to all of these countries, to give them, whatever it is that Putin feels is important about talking about. But, I mean, that's a serious event. That's, because now we're talking about, Ecuador is likely to be there. Venezuela will be there. Bolivia will be there. Union of South Africa, maybe 10 or 15 countries from Africa will be there. There'll be people from the Middle East there. All these countries will be there. And Xi Jinping has said to Vladimir Putin, come and talk to these people because I want them to hear what you have to say. That's dangerous.
I can go back to Bank of America real quick. I'm sorry. I have one question. The Silicon Valley Bank, some of the executives came out and said, when they were asked, why did you buy all these long dated bonds? And their answer, I believe, summarizing, is that they believed the Fed that inflation was transitory and the interest rates would stay low. and they were wrong. They didn't hedge. They didn't do anything to protect or balance their portfolio because they believed the Fed. At least that's my memory of it. What is Bank of America's excuse? Like, what are they saying as to why they let their balance sheet get so bloated with long-dated, low-interest securities?
Well, I mean, and I've mentioned this before, but I mean, for 5 years, I've been arguing with them to the point where they got so infuriated with me that they refused to talk to me any longer, refused to respond to my emails. That fortunately changed about a month and a half ago, and I've actually had a lot of conversations with them since then. Their policy was that if interest rates came down, they would make $1 billion for every 1% drop in interest. If interest rates went up, that they would make $1 billion in profit for every 1 billion, for every 1% that the interest rates would go up. Now, let me say that properly. For every 1% that interest rates would go up, they said they would make $1 billion. It was their view that by structuring their balance sheet in the fashion that they did, that, funding, the assets with very, very low cost deposits, that they would make a huge amount of money, and they refused to listen to the fact that the value of those assets would go down, and because obviously they're not going to mark them to market. So from their perspective, they were right. Their net interest income went up, last quarter or in the announcement today, and they claimed that they were right. And I claim that this is outrageous. You cannot ignore the fact that the increase in interest rates just knocked $150 billion, roughly speaking, off of your asset values and say that you were right because you did not make $150 billion in increases in net interest income. But the bottom line, the argument that I made with them constantly, year after year after year, is you are mismanaging the balance sheet. You are not managing that balance sheet correctly. You have just, not only did they do this, they went out and bought back $85 billion worth of stock. By buying back $85 billion worth of stock, they took current earnings out of the bank, because that 85 billion was supporting, some type of return. They reduced the ability to leverage it 10 to 1, which would have been 850 billion. And if they didn't do what they did, they'd have $850 billion in assets, which they could put at the Federal Reserve and get 5.25% in interest on it. But they just didn't see it. They didn't understand it. And I think it's outrageous that this guy should get paid this year because, he's a brilliant operator and there's virtually no one as good as him in running a bank. So I'm not saying that he should be removed or anything of that nature. He just shouldn't get paid. If the stockholders are sitting with a stock which is selling at the same price as it was selling in 1997, why should he get paid $25 million this year? And for the 5 years, that adds up to over $100 million. So he made over $100 million, and the stockholders, who bought that stock at any point in the last 5 years, are sitting with losses. It's just not right. I'm not seeing any accountability. I'm not seeing any indication from the bank that, we made a big mistake here and you lost a lot of money because we made that mistake. And we're sorry we did this to you, but we did it to you.
Retail sales came in very strong this morning, Dick. Way exceeded analysts' expectations. And you've been hammering on this idea that the consumer, your thesis, is being tapped out. The money supply shrunk by, it increased by 50% between the years 2019 to 2022. You mentioned that on Fox this morning. Yeah. So that was 7.5 trillion. Then it shrunk 2022 to now by over 1 trillion, but the economy didn't shrink by the same amount. And that makes perfect sense in my mind. But then the consumers are spending like gangbusters. How do we square that?
Well, basically, one of the charts, people don't know that before these calls, I send you a bunch of charts and stuff. Mm-hmm. One of the charts I sent you shows disposable personal income versus personal consumption expenditures. DPI versus PCE. All right. So the net effect is it shows that disposable personal income has been substantially higher than PCE, the consumption, for, this past couple of years, and that it's still a little bit higher than personal consumption expenditures. So they still have money, and they're spending it. And when they can't spend it, they're borrowing. When they can't use their own funds, they're borrowing it. And, again, we've mentioned before, the mortgage rate has gone from 3% to, 7.5%. The credit card rate has gone from 12% to 23%. The home, the auto loan rate has gone from 4.25% to 8.375%. So the net effect is, I think that, we're at the tip. We're at the tip, they're reaching the gasping point. And, we went through the the PI, consumer price index, CPI, and looked at category by category. And in fact, prices are coming down everywhere. Food prices are no longer going up aggressively, other than meats. Meats are the only thing that's continuing to go up. Most products that people buy are not going up rapidly in price anymore, and many of them are coming down in price. The only places where prices are going up meaningfully are in gasoline, and I guess that came down a little bit. Gasoline, rent, and hospital services. But other than that, sticker shock is going away from the consumer. So the consumer still has money. His income is still growing faster than the CPI. He's borrowing money on top of that. The prices of the goods that he saw over the last year are easing off, dramatically if these CPI numbers are correct. And that's why retail sales are doing so well right now. But I think that it will not continue, because I think that they're borrowing too much money. They're paying too much money for the borrowing. And at some point, they're going to wake up. Maybe it's going to be January 1st when they get all the bills from the holiday season. They're going to wake up and say, oh, my God, look, what did I do? And that's when you'll get the crunch.
January hangover. The Taylor Swift movie in theaters this weekend hit a box office record. Still that experience or experiential spending right now, quite amazing.
Yeah, it's the YOLO economy. You got to spend it while you have it. And
Right.
And these wars in Europe and the Middle East don't do
I think that's what's driving it, actually. I think there's an inherent fear among the population, and enjoy it while we're alive.
That's a very somber way of expressing it. I hope you're wrong, but
well, I'm hopeful. I think we'll get through all of this. Dick, you also said loan losses are skyrocketing.
Well, I mean, if you go back to every one of the banks that reported earnings in the last 4 or 5 days, it started last Friday, showed increases in loan losses. And again, picking on Bank of America, because I do enjoy doing that. Picking on Bank of America.
Would you enjoy it if they returned your calls? Is this just
if they returned my calls, then I wouldn't be so upset with them. And they are returning my calls now, so I can't say that any longer. But their loan losses were up 25% year over year. And a 75% increase in loan losses at Bank of America is hundreds of millions of dollars. So, we're not talking about something that I think is going to happen in the future. Every one of these banks show it, every one of them. So, we know that the consumer is now starting to feel the pressure, and we know that the consumer is starting to fail on their payments. I'll be very interested to see what happens when Capital One reports its earnings in about 10 days, or Ally Financial, which is the car loan company. It's going to be interesting to see what their numbers are. But all of these big banks are getting hit, and they're getting hit good.
When you say loan losses are up 75%, that sounds really bad. But can you put some perspective on it? I mean, are we talking about like they went from 0.2% to 0.25, 0.3% or something like that? I mean, is it really still a very small percentage, or and by saying 75%, it makes it sound like it's awful, or is it gone from 5% to, I don't know, 8.5%? What is the loan loss? In
the case of Bank of America, you're right. The net charge-offs went from $520 million to $931 million.
And this is on a $1 trillion balance sheet of sorts?
3 trillion. And the non-performing loans as a percentage of loans are now 0.5%. So, you're definitely right in saying that this is not a number which is, going to cause any great difficulty at the moment. But, it's the direction. If we could make the assumption that that number is going to stay there or it's going to turn around and go down, that would be one thing. But my assumption is that it's not going to stay there. It's going to go up significantly higher.
What is an unhealthy level for a bank? I mean, like what was it like during 2008 or 2009? Does it get as high as 1%? Does it get as high as 2%? Like where is it where you start to not be able to sleep at night if you're...
Well, this will make you feel better, but 5%. If a bank's loan portfolio has 5% defaults, the bank is finished. It can't recover from that.
So to be fair, they're a long way from that.
Bank of America is a long way from that. Yes. I don't think that Capital One is a long way from that because they're all credit card loans. And credit card loans, and again, the numbers just came out this morning and I haven't had a chance to go through all of them. I'm guessing that they're somewhere around 2.5% to 3% on their loan portfolio, in their credit card portfolio. Therefore, the credit card portfolio is going to continue to be a real problem. And the other problem is going to show up in the auto loan portfolio because you can easily get to 5% there. Now, you're never going to get there, hopefully, in your commercial lending portfolios. And, for all banks, commercial lending portfolios tend to be bigger than the consumer portfolios. So, you can get to 5% in credit card loan losses and still have, 0.5% in commercial loans. And it's not going to put the bank out.
Dick, you have a note. The banks have been shrinking, or the industry, the sector, let's say, and will continue to shrink. Citi keeps cutting people. At one point, at its peak, it had, by your estimation, 125,000 employees. It's been cutting staff net. Goldman is adding employees. That's pretty interesting.
Well, they added employees. In other words, the numbers that you're referring to are what happened up to the year 2022. At the present time, Goldman is reducing employees, but it's kind of interesting that the CEO's personality is having a big impact on Goldman because if you take the two companies you mentioned, Jane Fraser is this Scottish woman who is, absolutely brilliant in my view. And she gets up a couple of weeks ago, maybe 10 days ago, and says, we're now about to reduce employment again, and the number is 5,000 employees, and I'm good with that. She actually used the words, I'm good with that. All right. David Solomon, knocks off maybe 250, 300 people, and the press goes absolutely crazy about this guy being some kind of maniac who is doing all sorts of irreverent things, causing massive trouble in the company, whereas they never said a word about Jane, Fraser. They never said a word when Brian Moynihan got rid of 125,000 people. That 125,000, and he was complimented for doing it because it lowered the cost of the bank, made it a more efficient organization. Goldman Sachs, this guy just has a personality which apparently rubs people wrong in the press, and all they want to do is get him. And so they have not held back. Even when I tell them what I just told you, Charlie Scharf fired everyone in the top management team of Wells Fargo, every person, the top 25, right? And a whole bunch of people under them got fired, obviously, also. I mentioned what, Bank of America did. I mentioned what Citigroup did. James Gorman, who was in the same business as David Solomon, the head of Morgan Stanley versus Goldman Sachs, he's fired about 5,000 people. JP Morgan is the only company which is not really firing people en masse. Every time these companies fire people, they're complimented for doing it. Stock market loves it.
David Goldman doesn't get any, he gets heat from his critics.
Yeah, everybody wants to kill him. It's
maybe he needs an image consultant.
he needs a different personality, or he needs to shut up, whatever. But I don't understand how he can get hit so hard, firing fewer people than these other companies, and these other CEOs get complimented for doing it. It doesn't compute.
So looking forward the next 6 to 12 months, Dick, will the industry employment-wise be much smaller? Will more banks go out of business? Will there be more consolidation? Expect any trouble? And where might that trouble emerge?
Yeah, no, I don't expect any dire circumstance like occurred in 2006 to 2008. I think that the regulators did a really good job in terms of shoring up bank balance sheets. In other words, the Dodd-Frank Act, required these banks to put up a lot more liquidity on their balance sheets. It required them to increase their capital, and it started this process of forcing them to get rid of high-risk loans. Now, this new set of regulations, will take that a bit further. But we're talking about earnings. We're not talking about the stability of the banking industry or the ability of the banking industry to function. I think that that's not in question. It will function.
Looking at the big geopolitical macro picture, Dick and Matt, what's investors, institutional retail to do? How should they respond with all the troubles in the world and the uncertainties, financial, political? We have the war in Israel, the Middle East, we have Ukraine, trouble at our own borders, and just a great unsettling. And we had elections in Poland at the weekend. We'll see where that shakes out. Could be bad, could be positive. We don't know. And also this imminent, in air quotes, recession, the recession that has never occurred. It's going to happen sometime.
But we've been called it, and someday we'll be right. But
we've been very consistent in in terms of what I'm telling people they should be doing. First off, I believe that they should be cautious here, and by that I mean they should buy treasuries. Not long-term treasuries, short-term treasuries, under 90 days and just roll them. Second, we've been saying for your investment money, you should buy the preferred stocks and the long-term debt of the banks, because the yields on those securities are now in the 6.5–7% range, which is a very good return. And I don't think any major banks are going to go under. So I think that the yields are unrealistic at this point, and that when things get better, the yields will drop to 2 or 3%, which means the price of these preferreds will go up. And I think that, I've also pick certain stocks that I think, are worthy of taking a look at. I'm getting absolutely killed in Citigroup, which, as I mentioned before, I own it myself personally. But the point is that, I believe that this lady, Jane Fraser, is on the right track, is going to turn the bank around, et cetera, and that I think it'll more than double. But the point anyway is, at the moment, we're very consistent in saying stay at the short end of the yield curve, stay with high quality institutions, and then, as time goes by and you get a clearer picture of what is actually going to happen in the economy, you can move into, higher risk investments. At least that's what I tell the people that I deal with.
Look, the advice during uncertain times or times that you think are certain should consistently be the same. Get your house in order. Don't carry too much debt. Invest in real assets. Invest in yourself. Work hard. Save, more money than you spend. Just the basic things. The problem when you look at the overall American economy and some of this data that you see is almost incomprehensible. Like, I don't want to get the stat wrong, but I think it's close to half of Americans don't have enough savings to survive a $1,000 emergency type thing. And that's just unsustainable in an economy that's not always going to be growing. Recessions do come. If we don't have a recession this year, we don't have one next year, if we don't have one in the year after, you can go for a long time without having a recession. I believe Australia hasn't had a recession in something like 30 years. But when it comes, you don't want to be levered. You don't want to be long assets that have high volatility to their valuations. And I think that's just good advice to always have. Short end treasuries, always the safest, but they don't return as much as buying a good index fund. Over the long haul, over short haul, it's a great place to be safe if you think that volatility is coming. So I agree with Dick. I think volatility is coming. I think the market's going to get, it hasn't really reacted terribly to the two major wars that are going on, the war in the Middle East, the war in Europe yet, but we also haven't really had a functioning government to shift America's spending. And America's spending, as recently as the 1990s, was closer to 7 or 8% of GDP on defense, and we're now closer to 4% on GDP and defense. And if we're shifting to a wartime economy, it's going to really shift the way that the U.S. spending works, and the efficiency of the U.S. economy will be uncertainly diminished as we divert spending to destructive type spending as defense budgets and stuff. So it is coming. The world is not getting more stable right now. We're in a time of instability. The time of unipolarity and hegemony is in the past, and it's going to be a volatile couple decades, in my opinion.
Speaking of that, headline out of this morning's Wall Street Journal: war shifts global dynamics. Israel Hamas conflict relieves pressure on Russia. Iran and China detect opportunities. It's a changed world in a matter of several weeks. So watching that play out is going to be most interesting, and hopefully there'll be a positive outcome, and let's hope so.
Yeah, but unfortunately, hope is not a strategy.
We've talked in the past about why we need to produce things in the United States, and I went and looked. I had to actually put my glasses on to read this thing to you. But if you take a look at your iPhone, which Apple makes, and you take a look at what rare metals are in them, there are 13 rare metals in the iPhone, and they are cerium, dysprosium, europium, gadolinium, gallium, lanthanum, and I won't go down to the whole list. There's 11 of these things in an electric car. Magnets, which are apparently critical, big users of this dysprosium, whatever the hell that is, and gadolinium, and praseodymium. I can't say it. And then the second thing that I did was I said, okay, who makes this stuff? All right. And again, the United States is the leader in beryllium, 90%, and helium, 73%. South Africa is the leader in iridium, platinum, rhodium, ruthenium, and natural rubber. But then you get to China. China is the biggest producer of more of these products than all the other countries that I was able to find, that were lead in them. They do 87% of the antimony, 67% of the germanium. Magnesium, people know what that is. 87% of that. Scandium, 66%. And all this stuff is in cars, in iPhones, solar panels, and all this other stuff which is being made. We can't continue to let that happen. We have either got to find other materials which are as effective or more effective than these to put in the products that we make, or we've got to start mining these products which we want in all of our consumer goods. So I think that's a big issue. It's amazing. Apparently there's 61 million lines of programs in Facebook, and if they get ahead of us in these quantum computers, then they're going to get there in all sorts of stuff. The F-35, I think Matt told me that's the right name for that plane. The F-35 cannot fly without Chinese rare earths. We cannot allow that to continue. It has got to change.
I obviously wasn't alive during World War II, but when Pearl Harbor was attacked in 1941, there was a good 3 or 4 year gap between that attack and the invasion at Normandy and basically America joining the war. And my short version of history is because America tilted and changed its economy dramatically and spent 4 years reconstituting an army and reconstituting the capacity. Dick has said a few times on this that America always does the right thing after it's exhausted all other options. And all those minerals and metals that you're talking about, they exist on the North American continent. A lot of it is up in Canada, but a lot of it's in the United States as well. If we chose to, and it would cost money, I mean, and it would cost, it would carry with it some environmental costs that a lot of the politicians wouldn't want to bear under normal circumstances. But America could tilt its economy in a short period by changing laws, cutting red tape, and prioritizing in manufacturing and sourcing in North America. So it's not the end of the world if China cuts off all of our access. It's just the end of the world for a period of time while we fix ourselves and manufacture things here and restructure and re-incentivize businesses here to do things closer to home. And my hunch is that the reason we're not preemptively doing that is because it is expensive and because of the environmental cost and because it's not politically palatable at this time. And there's arguably no need if we are actually still viewing China as a trading partner. And it seems like that's where they want to be considered, and that's what we want to consider them. So, maybe the world doesn't make sense all the time, but it just seems like this is the cheapest, most rational policy for the facts and circumstances of this day and age.
We had quite a reaction to our segment last week on green energy, environmental degradation, and you cited from a book by a French author, Dick, and kind of dispelled a lot of the quote-unquote myths around some of this green energy debate. But it's an interesting thing too that the measurement of the so-called climate change, let's say in America, there's been a lot of talk about that because a lot of it's captured in these stations around in different cities, different urban areas, and so on. The tools that capture that have been in these areas for quite some time, and these areas have changed substantially. Some have now moved from being, open space, as it were, to urban settings, and they've changed. In other words, the temperatures they were capturing maybe a generation ago are not directly comparable to what they're doing today. So we're getting misreadings on the climate change, the change in temperatures. Some of these tools for capturing it are now stuck in car parks, and 40 years ago it was, barren land.
Yeah, well, what this guy Guillaume Petron in his book wrote was he took a look at how much danger to the environment there is in creating solar panel, and how much danger there is in creating all these batteries for automobiles that don't have infinite lives. And he concluded that if people really want to help the, if you will, world pollution situation, they better look at, their cell phone and their electronic car and their solar panel and a whole bunch of other products, which he mentioned, because they're creating more destruction of the environment than is gasoline. So it's a very complex subject, I guess is a simple way to say it.
I would point out, these costs are real, and the only reason green energy has been so successful, and I almost say that in air quotes, is because of taxpayer subsidies. And the New York State is pledged to go, I think, 80% green by 2030 and 100% green by 2050. And it turns out that the companies that are making these windmills have come back to the regulators asking for a 50% rate increase on their energy, because the cost of maintaining these windmills are so high that they're losing money competing with natural gas and hydro. And the New York is finally saying no, and it's kind of it's a current crisis that's going on right now, because Governor Hochul is concerned that she wants to meet these goals of being entirely green, but it is appearing that to go entirely green, you're going to have to pay something to the effect of 100 to 150% more than non-green energy sources. And you look across the pond at Germany, and one of the reasons their economy has suffered so much is because their cost of energy is just skyrocketed as they've shifted away from low cost, what's called fossil fuels, to windmills, and they use I can't remember what they call it, but they use recyclable type of plants that burn organic material of some sort, and it's just super, super, super expensive. And when you're in a world that is a competitive world, and Asia has no qualms about using quote unquote non-green energy costs, they have a cost advantage, extremely high cost advantage, when they're competing against the Western world that's using the most expensive energy on the planet. And at some point, something's going to break, and either the West is going to have to walk back some of its green initiatives, or we're going to have to get used to a lower standard of living than we've been used to in the past, because most of our money is going to be spent funding extremely expensive energy.
The latest numbers on EV sales, there's the recent quarter at least, there's been a decline in sales, a slackening that may just be a temporary blip. Some consumers are resisting buying them because of various impractical features. But I mean, if you have an EV that's cost effective and
well, I'm so sure that I mean, that doesn't, I don't know if that applies to Tesla, because their sales are still going.
Their sales, that was an exception, yeah.
And not only that, they're the only car company outside of China that is making money when they sell an electric car. But even they would not exist if it weren't for the energy credits that they sell to other car companies. I mean, it's basically a taxpayer subsidy that's gotten Tesla to where they are. And I think you could make a coherent argument that the plan worked, that's the goal. You subsidize these electric vehicles during the high ramp up period, and so they can get to a point where you can have manufacturing at a level that it's profitable. And if that's what it took to get Tesla there, and that's what the policymakers wanted, the plan worked. But let's just keep in mind, we're all paying for it, and it's redirecting money from more efficient uses, and it's going to lower the standard of living in the long run if we have to continue to subsidize and pay for more expensive energy than energy that's cheaper because we've chosen to.
Yeah, well, this guy that I keep referring to, what he's trying to do is have people redefine what a green environment is, because he's saying that the solutions that have been suggested, from solar plants to electronic cars to, windmills, are more expensive in terms of danger to the environment than are, fossil fuels. And that's something that if people are really concerned about the environment, they've got to think beyond just getting rid of gas.
Yeah, and the other thing, Toyota has been on the forefront of arguing something that's similar to that, because they've really avoided going all electric, because they say that for using about 1/10 of the size of battery, you get something about 80% of the emission savings by focusing on hybrid cars, and that America is making a mistake by focusing on electric only, and that they should, take what's the phrase? Don't let perfect be the enemy of good enough. EVs reduce emissions immensely. You can get an hybrid cars versus full gas powered cars that can go something like 3 times the distance on a full tank of gas, because they have the hybrid access or hybrid battery offering more efficiency on that car, and that it requires 1/10 of the rare minerals and rare earths that go into the batteries that power full electric cars. And he thinks America is making a mistake, and that they should be focusing on hybrids as a perfect stopgap between full electric and full gasoline.
In addition, we're going to have millions and millions and millions of batteries that go dead. The batteries,
they're going to have to be incinerated. They're going to destroy the environment.
Yeah, well, they emit carbon dioxide also.
Yeah.
So
but a good clean environment is certainly something we all aspire to, and there's so much waste in just our ordinary personal lives. I mean, I don't understand why that's not focused on more sometimes.
Well, and Thomas Sowell's famous for saying there are no solutions, there's only trade-offs, and I think we're trading off the wrong things, because these piles of batteries, you just look up the pictures of and look at the pictures of windmills that have been turned down. They can't recycle the windmills. They just take those blades and pile them in the forest somewhere, and it looks disgusting. And it doesn't seem like this is a good strategy, going full green before we're ready.
A great conversation. We covered quite a lot there, from the banks to the green energy debate and the geopolitical situation. And we'll be back next week for episode 92, and until then, take care.
Current and future holdings are subject to risk, and past performance is no guarantee of future results. This podcast should not be copied, distributed, published, or reproduced in whole or in part. Information presented herein is for discussion and illustrative purposes only and is not a recommendation or an offer or solicitation to buy or sell any securities. Securities identified do not represent all of the securities purchased, sold, or recommended to clients. The views and opinions expressed by the ODEON Capital Group speaker are their own as of the date of the recording. Any such views are subject to change at any time based upon market or other conditions, and ODEON Capital Group disclaims any responsibility to update such views. These views should not be relied on as investment advice, and because investment decisions are based on numerous factors, may not be relied on as an indication of trading intent on behalf of any ODEON Capital Group product. Neither ODEON Capital Group nor the speakers can be held responsible for any direct or incidental loss incurred by applying any of the information offered.